Happy Saturday. It's December 14th, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And what a week it's been in the news, Michael. The Assads have fled Syria, and they are safely ensconced in Russia, where it turns out that one of the world's most nefarious dictators is about to become, that's right, an ophthalmologist again, at least according to early reports on X, formerly known as Twitter. We shall see if that actually transpires. Meanwhile, in New York, unfortunate news, Michael. Daniel Boulud's Danielle restaurant, which had 3 Michelin stars for the longest time, was downgraded to 2 and then lost another one this week. And I have to say I'm upset about this. I find this to be incredibly unfair, although who needs ratings anyway? But as usual and as always, Airmail and Morning Meeting are the antidote to all of these pressing issues of the day.
Absolutely. First, lots of people claim they can reform education in America, most recently Donald Trump. But Bill Cohen is going to join us from New York with a cautionary tale of the charter school entrepreneur who went from being one of the most acclaimed operators in the education sphere to losing it all. Will he be able to make a comeback? Bill's going to tell us. Then, speaking of comebacks and fade-outs, our own Jeanne Mal will join us to discuss something very fun, a list we are calling the Airmail Over-Under list, wherein we present 2024's most overhyped and underhyped people and things. And finally, something that deserves more hype is a magazine from the 1970s called New Times. It's long forgotten, unfortunately, but Alex Belth is going to tell us about how this short-lived publication punched way above its weight, tackling the big issues of the day while elevating a new generation of writers and whose influence still lives on. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Well, Michael, let's start with a bit of grouchiness and a bit of joy. Jeanne Mal, an associate editor here at Airmail, is here to reveal the results of our inaugural Over-Under list. Welcome, Jeanne.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right, I have so many questions. We have a very exhaustive list of things that are both overhyped and underhyped, and some of them are obvious. For example, raw milk and the Menendez brothers, others less so. So first of all, where to begin on this? Let's talk about personal truths. That's the top item on your list so far of overhyped. What do you guys mean by that, Jeanne?
A lot of these are paired. So personal truth, for example, is paired with the other top one, underhyped, which is good manners. And it's a little bit up to interpretation, but we were mostly thinking about how people really like to express themselves and have their opinions trump other people's and not really care how it sounds.
So is this to say that you think that the whole era of psychobabble is kind of over?
Yes, I think so. I graduated college a year ago, and personal truths at college were truly the most important thing in the classroom context and outside of it. They trumped people's feelings, but also what teachers had to tell them. So I think listening to other people kind of goes with the good manners thing of respecting what people have to say if it doesn't feel particularly nice to you.
I feel like we should also add bearing witness to this list of things that are overhyped and maybe shutting up to the list of things that are underhyped. But that's a story for another day. Okay, Michael and I are going to really take offense to this next one. You guys apparently have something against tall person energy and you like short person energy. We can't help this, okay?
Yeah, that's kind of in reference to the whole rise of the short king trend of the last year or two. And I feel like the energy is even more important and less talked about because, as you said, you can't help it, but everybody wants to have tall person energy, which I think is a mistake. I think it's okay if you have short person energy and that those are great qualities too.
Okay, moving on. What do you guys have against the Oura ring? Am I chuggy just for wearing mine? Do I have to take it off?
Maybe it's chuggy, but I also think I don't really believe in it. I don't really understand why everybody loves it. I also think the demographic of people who wear it is very specific and that clearly the Oura Ring people have targeted the right group.
Also, they're ugly AF.
They're so ugly.
It's you might as well be wearing Earth shoes in the 70s or, I don't know, it's just they're
You guys are nuts.
You can't design something better if you want to track these things.
Michael, okay, have you seen a Whoop? Okay. Have you seen a Fitbit? Those things are hideous. I bought the Oura Ring because it looks better than that.
At least the Fitbit slides under a sleeve of your jacket and you can't see it.
Everyone just thinks that I have a thick gold wedding ring. That's what it looks like.
It says hi, I've joined a cult.
Fine. Okay, whatever. This is a battle that I can't win, but I will say it has completely changed almost every behavior in my life, like everything, the way that I sleep, the way that I eat.
You're the most stylish woman we know, Ashley, and you're wearing an Oura ring. No, can't. It's going to ruin any outfit you put it with.
I think the black one is the worst.
I just have the yellow gold. And I have to say mine broke recently after 2.5 years of wearing it every day.
Good.
And I'm at a loss. Okay, whatever. Okay. Okay, moving on. You guys think the West Village is overhyped? I mean...
Yes.
Jean, this is sacrilege. Okay, our office is in the West Village. Michael lives in the West Village.
I live in the West Village. I just want to put it out there.
Thank you.
I've tried to be not biased, but also obviously I'm extremely biased. I love the West Village in theory. I leave my house. I live on the same block where like the Carrie Bradshaw house is. And it just is quite scary to leave my house, let's say on a Sunday when I'm tired, and there's everybody who looks like they aren't dressed for the photo op of their lives. Meanwhile, the Upper East Side gets a very bad rep, but everything that you could ever want is up there, except maybe fun. However, leaving out your house and having a crowd of people is not particularly funny either.
Okay, you guys also have a problem with non-ethical monogamy. Are we just tired of reading trend stories about this in the New York Times?
Yeah, that's a huge reason. But I also think that like it gives people way too much space for cheating and sort of taking the easy way out. I've never spoken to someone who's in an open relationship and who is happy with the person they're actually in a relationship with.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Those Time stories about this, again, I feel like it's like they show up in your feed or in the paper when you read it, and it's like, I feel like I've just been cornered by someone at a cocktail party who wants to tell me about, and it's like, get away from me. It's right up there with another thing that I agree is overhyped is California sober. Again, just like wanting the best of both worlds. No, it's not. Just like be an adult and take a stand. Done.
Exactly. Completely agree. Yeah, New York Mag did a whole story about ethical non-monogamy, and I was reading the examples, and I just thought I would hate to be in this kind of relationship.
The goal is to make your life less complicated.
Yeah, people want to be unhappy, I guess.
Okay, Jen, on that note, private clubs. I mean, this is something we talk about at Airmail all the time. There are so many of them that are opening or have opened in New York in the past probably 18 months. Are we over private clubs even before they have reached their apex?
I've been over them since day one.
Bless you. Tell us more.
The way that I had originally thought about it is having the opposite of that, be underhyped, inviting everybody you know. I think people these days love to complain about New York and how it used to be more fun and all this kind of stuff. But creating private clubs where the same people that you see all of the time go and get invited is not going to help the situation.
What about a private club of people who want to be in thruples? And they're all California sober. There's a nice little group, okay?
Michael, if you build it, they will come. That's your next business venture.
True. It might exist, honestly.
Yeah.
I was so relieved to see that you all are not in the thrall of Ballerina Farm and that you find trad wives to be overhyped. Feminism is coming back. Hooray.
I kept that one pretty broad. I feel like people are over feminists, and I don't quite think that's the right way to go. And I also do not like the argument, by the way, that trad wives are a form of feminism. I think they're just really hyping up consumerism, if anything.
They're all there just to sell you that raw milk and that beef tallow moisturizer.
Yeah, they're all there to tell you that that really expensive blender will help all of your problems.
Well, Jean, thank you so much. We love this list. We love talking to you. And please keep fighting the good fight on our behalf. We look forward to the next one.
Thank you so much, guys.
Oura rings for all.
Michael, we'll take this offline.
Michael, I'll get you one for Christmas.
Let's get Bill Cohan on here to talk about Chris Whittle. To many, he is the entrepreneur behind the Edison Project, which was a chain, or is still a chain, of charter schools throughout the United States. But he got his start in media, and it's a fascinating go big or go home story. And who better than Bill to tell it to us? Bill is a writer at large at Airmail and the author of best-selling books, including The Last Tycoons, House of Cards, and The Price of Silence. He's also a founding partner of Puck, and his latest book is called Power Failure. Welcome, Bill.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So, Bill, once again, you have shown me so much more than I ever thought I wanted to know about this gentleman, Chris Whittle. I mean, for me, he was the Edison Project guy, but he had a big career in publishing. He was in all sorts of businesses. So before we get to the story of this somewhat diminished man at his small home in Sharon, Connecticut, take us back to the glory days. How did this entrepreneur get his start?
Well, he's from rural eastern Tennessee, from a relatively prominent family. He was sort of entrepreneurial from the start, journalistic from the start. He worked for the local newspapers, delivered papers, went to the University of Tennessee, and sort of first came up with some sort of early, like Facebook-like information guide about the university and things to do in and around the university town. Met a guy named Moffett. The two of them became friends and decided to expand this publication into a wider area. One thing led to another. They moved to New York and bought Esquire magazine, and we're sort of off to the races. I mean, these two young kids from Tennessee buying Esquire made a big impact on the New York media scene at the time. And they took it over, and it was struggling. Eventually, the two, went their separate ways. This is sort of where you actually pick up the story with Chris deciding he was sort of at a crossroads. He didn't know whether to run for governor of Tennessee or to pursue a career disrupting the education industry in this country, the public school industry in this country. And for whatever reasons, he abandoned his desire to be a governor of Tennessee and started with the Edison Schools Project, which led to Channel One, which led to a variety of different projects that he was involved with. But he was a big deal in his day. He was dashing, wore bow ties, very stylish, great head of hair. Speaking of great heads of hair, and it made a big impact in the media world and was subject of profiles. And he was somebody that was definitely talked about in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, Bill, but we really have to talk about the heart of this story, which is the real estate. I mean, there was the 10-room apartment in the Dakota. There was the house on Georgia Pond in East Hampton. I mean, take us through this guy's lifestyle of the rich and famous.
Well, he made a lot of money when he sold various businesses off. Sold part of his first business off to a European investor, sold pieces of the Edison project and Whittle Communications, which was his second project, to Time Warner. They bought half of it for about $185 million, which again was a big deal at the time. Seems like relatively small potatoes today, but back in the day to have Time Warner buy half your business. So he makes no apologies about enjoying his lifestyle and the things that his entrepreneurial success bought him. Access to private jets, the apartment in the Dakota, spending $7 million on this huge estate on Georgia Pond. He would plow his winnings into his various next, projects. After he sold Whittle Communications, he started the Edison project using a bunch of, his own money. And then part of the way he got his money, Ashley, was as the house in the Hamptons, which he paid $7 million for, which people thought was a lot at the time, became increasingly more valuable. And at one point, he thought it was worth like $140 million. He would use it as the security for loans against, he would take mortgages out against the house and use that as an equity investment in his deals. And, as he tells me, it worked out for the longest time, and was willing to take huge chances and, put his own real estate, used his own real estate as collateral for these loans, and which became the equity investments. And then finally, his last project, Whittle Schools, which he started right before COVID hit, and that was pretty much the end of that. And he lost his equity investment in Whittle Schools, and then eventually lost his house to his creditors.
Bill, I forgot that he had been involved with Avenues, which is still a private school in New York City that threatened or attempted to disrupt the notoriously Byzantine world of New York City private schools with a for-profit model. I know he signed an NDA and he left avenues, I think, in 2013. But what happened? What went wrong? Like, what do we know about that whole situation?
He raised a lot of money for avenues, bought this empty warehouse near the High Line, completely renovated it into this like K through 12 new private school, charging like $45,000 tuition. He had done a study and discovered that, most new private schools in New York City, to the extent that there are that many of them, in their first year, they attract like 50 students, or 50 applications or whatever, avenues, the High Line attracted like 750. It was one point it was worth like $2 billion. And then the stock came way down during the era of for-profit investigations of for-profit schools. He then took it private with a private equity firm named Liberty. It frankly ended up not working out, although the school still exists. He left and then started in on avenues, with Liberty being one of his investors there. Long story short there, for some reason, which is not exactly clear because he signed this NDA, along comes John Fisher, who owns the heir to the Gap clothing fortune, such as it is, the guy, who owned the Oakland Athletics and is much reviled owner of the Oakland Athletics, moving the team to Las Vegas. He decided, for whatever, since he wanted to buy Avenues schools and essentially made a hostile offer. I mean, we're talking about a private company here, made a hostile offer to take over the school. Chris countered, but the investors sided with Fisher. This guy, Fisher, became a creditor of Chris's and basically was the one that threw the house in the Hamptons into foreclosure, even though he was in a subordinated position and wasn't going to end up with the house. His more senior creditors were the ones who had financed this Whittle Schools, which was the subsequent project, got control of the house and are actually, in the process of trying to sell it. He, I think made the mistake of thinking that, using his house as collateral for loans had worked a few times. He was always able to refinance, but over time he couldn't make the mortgage payments and couldn't get any more money, and he couldn't refinance. And, what often happens is his creditors took control of it. Now he's living in a salt box in Sharon, Connecticut, divorced from his wife of 30 plus years, who was, a scion of the Agnelli family, and two daughters. Again, he's remarkably sunny and upbeat.
I mean, Bill, it seems like this is a guy whose motto was kind of go big or go home. And at the end of the day, he moved home. But what's the lesson here for all of us?
Well, first of all, I think that was his motto. The passion that he's bringing to this new project, this Barrett Scholars Program, is very impressive. I mean, the guy has incredible salesmanship and powers of persuasion. So I'm not ruling him out either.
Bill, thank you so much for this great story. We always love speaking with you. Happy holidays, and we'll talk to you in 2025.
Okay. Thank you all.
Michael, let's move on to New Times Magazine. Again, another blast from the past media-wise, full of lessons for today, it seems.
For sure. It's a magazine that had a short lifespan, but had a big impact. And Alex Belth has a well-reported, terrific story this week all about it.
Alex is the editor of Esquire Classic and the curator of the Stax Reader. He has also worked in film editing, working for Ken Burns, Woody Allen, and the Coen brothers. Welcome, Alex.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Alex, as you report in your wonderful story, the New Times was a magazine that was published only for about 5 years in the 1970s, but its legacy is disproportionate to its lifespan. Tell us a little bit about how it was founded.
Well, it was founded by George Hirsch, who was the original publisher of New York Magazine. And Hirsch had worked for Time Inc. when he was lured away by Clay Felker to start up New York Magazine. And that was in 1968. And after about a couple of years, I think Felker had a kind of managerial style that had, well, let's say, he had sharp elbows. And George Hirsch really couldn't take it after a few years and was really looking for his next project. And, this was the time where the new journalism had really sort of become part of the hip way to cover journalism in a kind of a narrative way at the time. And so Hirsch's idea was sort of to take the model of like the Village Voice or the Boston Phoenix alt weeklies and try to make a national magazine out of that. And that was sort of the idea.
Tell us a bit more about the players behind it and sort of its launch pad, right? Who are its competitors at that time?
Well, geez, the competitors, I guess they were really trying to create their own niche on a national level because you had magazine like Harper's. The Atlantic Monthly certainly was a venerable magazine, but wasn't a particularly hip magazine at the time. New York Magazine was a very hot magazine. Esquire in the 60s was a hot magazine. And so essentially the original idea for Hirsch was to basically empty out his Rolodex from all the folks that had written for him at New York Magazine and bring them over. So there was names that would have been very familiar to the Harper's Magazine crowd of the late 60s, David Halberstam, Jimmy Breslin, Joe McGinnis, Murray Kempton. And those were the bylines that populated the first dozen or so issues of New Times. And unfortunately for New Times, they found that these A-list writers were giving them C-list material. And so very quickly, Jonathan Larson, who was a Time Inc. editor and writer, came over and became the editor-in-chief about, I think, 10 issues in. And he brought in younger writers that were fresh, hungry, and also reflected more of the sensibility that he wanted to imprint on the magazine.
And one of those was Frank Rich, right?
Yeah, well, Frank Rich was one of the first hires, and he was a 24-year-old guy who had attracted some attention for himself. Just when he was out of Harvard, he wrote a long piece on Daniel Ellsberg for Esquire, and then he was working at an alt weekly in Richmond, Virginia, where when he met George Hirsch and interviewed with him, and instantly George Hirsch was like, yeah, this kid, we need to hire him. And so he was an editor, but just because they needed bodies to do things, he also became their first film critic. And he became a film critic for them at just one of the great times to be a film critic in American movies, because Robert Altman and Scorsese, Spielberg, those guys were really starting to hit at the time. And those are the movies that he was able to write about.
And Alex, why do you think that this garnered such an enthusiastic and loyal audience so quickly? What was it about these stories?
Well, the stories were smart, of course. I mean, Frank Rich was sort of anchoring an art section. Janet Maslin was writing music for those guys. Jeffrey Wolf wrote about books for them. So their art section was very solid. But really, Ashley, what distinguished the magazine was a kind of muckraking, investigative sensibility that really took on hard stories. And Jonathan Larson was very, very interested in things like the environment, political corruption, especially environmental stories, way before that became popular. And so even the left-wing guys like Frank Rich or Harry Stein or some of the other editors on the magazine who would have been very involved with left-of-center politics at the time, they might not have been thinking on that environmental vein that Jonathan Larson was. And so New Times spent an awful lot of time in court in the 1970s because they had stories that really pushed people's tolerance, and they found themselves in court quite a bit, and they never lost in court either. But that was the kind of magazine they were.
Alex, one of the things you note, great magazines sometimes they burn bright and fast, and their period, and yet their influence goes on. But, you know, 5, 6, 7 years it was around. Short time, 73 to 79, which is strangely 3 presidents, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. And sort of like in that period of the 70s, it's sort of a chicken and egg. Does the magazine shape the moment, or does the moment shape the magazine, or is it both? And then, curiously, just as Reagan is ascending in the 80s and that whole zeitgeist is going to shift, it closes. But what is its legacy? How does it live on and its impact, when you look across its lifespan and what happens to all that talent and how do we see it living on?
I think that's an interesting question, Michael, because when you think about certain periods of magazine history, again, I mentioned Willie Morris at Harper's in the 60s, they sort of have these reputations that sort of live on. And the 60s is such a romanticized era, but the 70s sometimes gets lost a little bit. And I would say that really the biggest legacy was the fact that young writers were really encouraged to write these kinds of tough stories. They had the backing of both the publisher and the editor and encouragement. And also, you could pretty much almost literally walk in off the street and pitch a story to John Larson. And if he liked it, he would take it. And so that kind of encouragement for young writers, I think, was huge. And then you just look at the masthead of people. I mean, we mentioned Frank Rich. Tony Schwartz started out there as like our stringer in college. Marshall Frady was a name that's not really so well remembered now, but was a tremendous writer from the old Harper's days who did great work for them. And then you think about people like Robert Sam Anson or Ron Rosenbaum, and then Lawrence Wright. I mean, Lawrence Wright was a young writer there, and he was really able to first stretch his legs, I think, at that place. And so Wright wrote a very, very lovely letter to Jonathan Larson after the magazine folded and said sort of as much that, he had always sort of pined and fantasized about being in one of those great literary scenes and moments. And for him, he felt that New Times was exactly that.
We're living in such a period of change and distrust of mainstream media. I mean, are there any lessons from New Times that we as journalists and, as media entrepreneurs and publishers and editors can take from the story of New Times?
Oh, good Lord. That's probably a little bit beyond my capacity to articulate, I think. But one thing that you really do see about New Times is they had the courage of their convictions. They were fearless in terms of being able to take on corporations. First of all, they were the first first magazine to ever report on the Karen Silkwood case. They were not afraid to rankle people and that in this particular moment feels like it is something to champion about New Times, particularly as you feel like elements of that might be lost.
Yeah, and as I think you say, that cavalcade of young talent that was hothoused there and then went on to sort of really shape, the voice of 80s magazines and on through there.
Peter Kaplan, Jane Anderson, Susan Lyne. Yeah, I mean, there's serious players in here.
Yeah, just tremendous talent.
Brandon Tartikoff, who became a huge executive at NBC, wrote for them. Carl Hiaasen, the novelist. And that's what's wonderful about those kinds of publications is you go back into it, you're like, oh my God, this is where, and so many people got opportunities, got shots there, and they seem to all hold a great affection for it as well.
It's funny, it makes me think in a small way. You mentioned, it was different but similar, but launched around the same time as SNL. SNL kind of, had that same kind of voice and maybe a little bit of DNA. But obviously, New Times, not celebrating its 50th anniversary, but at least we've got you telling us why 50 years later it still is such an influential piece of the culture.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, some things aren't meant to last long, Michael, and we know that the history of magazines is littered with great, interesting, funky publications that lasted 6 issues, 12 issues. And often when you do talk to the folk that were involved in it, they will have similar feelings as the ones that worked for New Times, where it was when they were young, it was when things were all laid out in front of them, their careers were all laid out in front of them. And then, they're all just hustling and working as hard as they can just to put something out on deadline. But then you can look back years and years later and you find a real porthole into the sensibilities, attitudes, and thinking of that particular moment.
Alex, what a wonderful story. And thank you so much for taking us back to these, dare I say, happier, more simple times of the 1970s.
Michael, happier times in the mid-70s. Can you imagine that?
Well, there you go. Everyone's nostalgic.
Ashley, thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate it.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report, our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it, is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
Michael, it is the weekend. I know you have something to recommend to us. Please do share.
I do. And as we all kind of wait for Timothée Chalamet to appear as Bob Dylan in that new biopic, I've got another espionage mini limited series. Had a lot this fall, from Slow Horses Return to Agency, which is the reboot of The Bureau, all of them set in London. We've got another one too set in London. It's called Black Doves, and it's on Netflix. It stars Keira Knightley and Ben Whishaw. And the Black Doves are a group of long game spies who don't toil in service to any particular government or cause, rather, as their ringleader kind of tells you, they go to the highest bidder. I can't believe it's got Keira Knightley, who's great in this, and Whishaw, who has played Q in the James Bond movies, and here kind of shifts to being a real sort of espionage guy. But it's fun. It's kind of got a Kill Bill kind of vibe to it at times, and I'm sticking with it. I've seen 1-2 episodes so far. It's called Black Doves, and it is streaming on Netflix now. And you, my dear, what do you have for us?
Michael, you know how grouchy I get about the prices of hotels these days. Well, we have a great article in the issue by Patricia Zone. She is alerting us to the fact that there have been some new houses added to the Iconic Houses collection. So if you go to iconichouses.org, you'll see them, but these are masterpieces of mid-century design all over the world, and 10 great houses that you can not only visit and admire, but also potentially stay in. So if you're trying to plan a holiday and you love mid-century modern design, these are the places to go. And, really appealing destinations all over the place, from Wellfleet, Massachusetts to San Rafael, California, all the way out to Paimio, Finland, Prague, Germany, Trento, Italy, Berlin. I mean, lots of beautiful places to stay. So check it out. It's at iconichouses.org, and read the article in Airmail by Patricia Zone. Well, and on that note, we thank you all so much for joining us. We wish you a wonderful, cozy weekend. Mike, will you please read us out?
Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. Our deputies are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We'll be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thanks again for joining us.